Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Introduction. The Dream of Mandalay. Last night I dreamt I went to Mandalay again. I stood in front of the iron gates at the beginning of the drive. When I had first seen those gates, they had been open wide to welcome me. Now in my dream they were closed. Behind them the drive went on to Mandalay. In my dream I was able to pass through the closed gates. I walked up the long winding drive. The trees and flowers grew near to the drive and grass almost covered it. As I came to the last bend of the drive, I felt the old excitement. I was near to Mandalay again. At last I could see Mandalay. The old house was as beautiful as ever. It was moonlight in my dream. The pale light shone on the windows and grey stone walls of the old house, and in my dream I saw the sea. It was silent and smooth as glass. For a moment, the house seemed full of light. I thought that we were living there, happy and secure. The moonlight shone more clearly. Now I saw that Mandalay was an empty shell. Only the grey stone walls remained standing. No one would ever live there again. We would never live there happily, Maxim and I. We would never live there free of Rebecca, free from thoughts of the past. I woke up. Mandalay was far away. Hard, bright sunlight shone into our bare hotel room. The long, empty day lay in front of us. Nothing much would happen. Nothing ever did. But we had a quiet peace, Maxim and I, that we had never known before. We did not talk about Mandalay. I would never tell Maxim my dream. Mandalay was no longer ours. It had been destroyed long ago by evil and hate. We shall never go back to England. Even after nearly 20 years, the past is too near to us. We try to forget the fear and terror, but sometimes we remember. We are often bored in this dull little hotel, but people who are bored are not afraid. We read the English newspapers, but we never meet English people, thank God. This hot little Mediterranean island is our home now. We shall never again feel the softer warmth of the English sun. We shall never again stand in the happy valley and smell the scent of its flowers. Here the hard light of the sun shines on white walls. The trees are dusty. The sea is a clear blue. We have lost a lot, but I have at last grown up. I am very different from the shy, frightened girl who first went to Mandalay. The fear and the terror made me a woman. A dull woman, perhaps, but I am with my husband, and he is all I need. Sometimes I see a strange, lost look in Maxim's eyes. I know that his thoughts are far away. Then he sits quiet and still in his chair. After a time, he begins to talk. We talk about anything in order to forget the past. We have both known fear. We have both known pain and loneliness. That is all over now. Mandalay has been destroyed, but we are still alive, and we are both free. Chapter 1. I Meet Maxim de Winter. What would I be today if I had not gone to Monte Carlo with Mrs. Van Hopper? I would have lived another life. I would have become a different person. Mrs. Van Hopper was not a pleasant woman. She loved to meet people who were rich and famous. Every summer, Mrs. Van Hopper stayed at the Hotel Côte d'Azur, the biggest and most expensive hotel in Monte Carlo. Here, Mrs. Van Hopper found out which well-known people were staying in the town. She always found an excuse to speak to them. Then, pretending to know them well, she asked her victims rude questions in her loud American voice. I was young and shy. I hated my life with Mrs. Van Hopper, but she paid me a little money to be her companion. I was not exactly a servant, and certainly not a friend. We must have looked a strange pair as we walked into the hotel restaurant that day. Mrs. Van Hopper walked in front of me on her high-heeled shoes. Her fat, heavy body swayed above her short, fat legs. I followed slowly, my eyes looking down at the floor. With my straight hair and badly fitting clothes, I looked like an awkward schoolgirl. Mrs. Van Hopper sat down at her usual table and stared at everyone in the restaurant.
"There isn't one well-known person here," she said in her loud voice. "There's no one I want to talk to."
Mrs. Van Hopper was very greedy. She ordered a large lunch for herself. Soon she was eating a large plateful of spaghetti. We ate in silence. The rich sauce ran down Mrs. Van Hopper's chin. I looked away. Then I saw that a new guest was sitting down at the next table. Mrs. Van Hopper saw him too. She put down her fork and stared at him hard. I saw an excited look come into her small eyes.
"It's Max de Winter," she said to me. "The man who owns Manderley. Oh, you must have heard of it. A beautiful old house in the west of England. He looks ill, doesn't he? His wife died suddenly last year. They say he's broken-hearted."
I felt sorry for de Winter already. He was Mrs. Van Hopper's next victim. She finished her meal as quickly as possible. I knew what she was going to do. There was a long seat in the hotel lounge with a low table in front of it. The seat was between the restaurant and the main door of the hotel. Everyone who left the restaurant had to walk past this seat.
"I'll take my coffee in the lounge," Mrs. Van Hopper told the waiter. "Straight away."
She turned to me, her eyes shining.
"Go upstairs and find the letter from my nephew, Billy. Bring it to me in the lounge and the photographs, too. Billy met Max de Winter in London. Be quick."
I went up to Mrs. Van Hopper's rooms as slowly as I could. I hoped that de Winter would get away before I returned. When I came back with the letter, Mrs. Van Hopper was already on the seat in the lounge. De Winter was sitting next to her. He was a dark-haired, handsome man. His face was pale and his dark eyes had a sad, lost look. De Winter stood up politely as I gave Mrs. Van Hopper her letter.
"Mr. De Winter is having coffee with us. Go and ask the waiter for another cup," Mrs. Van Hopper told me.
"No, you are my guests," said De Winter. He called the waiter. In a moment, De Winter was sitting on a small chair, and I was next to Mrs. Van Hopper on the long seat.
"I recognized you at once," Mrs. Van Hopper said. "I met you at my nephew's party in London. But I don't suppose you remember an old woman like me."
And Mrs. Van Hopper gave De Winter one of her biggest smiles.
"You are wrong. I could never forget you," said De Winter in a cold, hard voice. "Billy's on holiday now," Mrs. Van Hopper went on. "He loves traveling, but if he had a home like Manderley, he would never leave it. People say that Manderley is one of the most beautiful houses in England. I wonder what you're doing here in Monte Carlo."
For a few moments there was silence. Then De Winter spoke.
"Manderley was looking very lovely when I came away."
There was another silence. De Winter had not answered Mrs. Van Hopper's question. She was not silent for long, of course. She started to tell De Winter all the unpleasant gossip of Monte Carlo. After his moment of rudeness, De Winter listened to her politely. I looked down at the floor and tried not to hear Mrs. Van Hopper's loud voice. At last she had to stop. A waiter came up to her with a message. Mrs. Van Hopper's dressmaker was waiting for her upstairs. De Winter stood up at once.
"You mustn't keep your dressmaker waiting," he said.
Mrs. Van Hopper smiled.
"You must have a drink with me," she said. "Why not tomorrow evening? I'm having a few friends." "I'm sorry," De Winter said quickly. "I shall be away all day tomorrow. If you will excuse me."
He turned and walked out of the lounge.
"What a strange man Max de Winter is," said Mrs. Van Hopper when we were standing in the lift. "He left so suddenly. But he is certainly an attractive man. By the way, dear, you are rather rude to him. You must look at people when they're speaking. You're not a child, you know."
Mrs. Van Hopper was soon busy with her dressmaker. I sat on a window seat, looking at the bright day outside. I could not go out. Some of Mrs. Van Hopper's friends were coming to tea. They were fat, rude women like herself. My job was to talk to them, light their cigarettes, and tidy the room after they had gone. There was a knock on the door. A waiter came in with a note in his hand. "Madame is in the bedroom," I told him. But the note was for me. There were a few words in an unknown handwriting. "Forgive me. I was very rude after lunch." The note was not signed, but I knew it was from De Winter.
"Is there an answer?"
the waiter asked me. I looked up. No answer," I said. After the waiter had gone, I put the note in my pocket. Mrs. Van Hopper called me from her bedroom. I got up slowly, thinking about De Winter and about Mandalay. Chapter 2. A Day Out Together. The following day, Mrs. Van Hopper woke up with a sore throat and a high temperature. I rang up her doctor and he came round at once. "You have flu, madame," the doctor told her. "You won't get better unless you stay quietly in bed. Your heart isn't strong. You'll need a nurse to look after you. You must stay in bed for a week or 2. "I'm sure I could look after Mrs. Van Hopper," I said. But the doctor said no. To my surprise, Mrs. Van Hopper agreed with him. Monte Carlo had begun to bore her. She would enjoy staying in bed. She would enjoy giving orders to the nurse as well as to me. The nurse soon arrived, and I was no longer wanted. I went down to the restaurant by myself. I was glad to be alone. It was half an hour before our usual lunchtime. The restaurant was almost empty. I went to our usual table. Then I saw that De Winter was already at his table. It was too late for me to go back. I sat down awkwardly, trying not to look at him. As I picked up the menu, I knocked over the flowers on the table. The water went all over the cloth and ran down onto my skirt. The waiter was at the other end of the restaurant and saw nothing. In a moment, De Winter was standing by my chair. "You can't sit here now," he said. He called to the waiter who came up at once. "Lay another place at my table," De Winter said. "This lady is lunching with me." "Oh, no," I said. "I couldn't." "Why not?" he said. "I want you to have lunch with me. I was going to ask you anyway. Come and sit down. You needn't talk if you don't want to." We ordered our food and sat for a time in a pleasant, easy silence. "What's happened to your friend?" De Winter asked me. I told him about Mrs. Van Hopper's illness. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "You got my note, I suppose. It's very kind of you to lunch with me after my rudeness." "You were not rude," I said. "At least, she did not think you were. She is always so curious about anyone important." "Important? Why does she think that I'm important?" De Winter asked. "I think it's because of Mandalay," I said. He did not answer. I felt that he did not want to talk about his home. "Your friend is very different from you," he said at last. "And she's much older than you, too. Is she a relation?" "Mrs. Van Hopper is not my friend," I said. "I work for her. I have to. I need the money. I have no family, and there is nothing else I can do." De Winter asked me more questions about myself. I forgot my shyness. I told him about my father, who had been a painter. I talked about my mother and her great love for my father. When my father had died very suddenly, my mother had lived only a few weeks after him. I suddenly realized that we had been sitting at the table for more than an hour. I began to apologize. "But I've enjoyed this hour so much," De Winter said. "We are alike in some ways. We are both alone in the world. I have a sister, but that's all." "You forget," I told him, "that you have a home, and I have none." "An empty house, even a very beautiful one, can be lonely," De Winter said. I thought for a moment that he was going to tell me about Mandalay, but instead he said, "Well, I suppose you have a holiday this afternoon. What are you going to do?" I told him that I was going to do some sketching. I wanted to draw some of the old houses in a nearby town. The bus left at 2:30. "I'll drive you there in my car," De Winter said. "Go upstairs and get your coat." I got my things very quietly. I did not want Mrs. Van Hopper to hear me. I ran down the stairs, holding my gloves in one hand. I felt excited and grown up. I did not feel shy with De Winter. He enjoyed my company. He had asked me to go out with him in his car. We soon reached the place where I wanted to sketch, but the wind was too strong. It blew the paper away. We got into the car again and drove on up the steep mountain road. Then suddenly the road came to an end. De Winter stopped the car at the very edge. Far below us lay the sea. I felt cold and a little afraid. "Do you know this place?" I said. "Have you been here before?" De Winter looked at me as though I were a stranger. He was lost in the past. There was a strange, faraway look on his face. He looked like a man walking in his sleep. "It's getting late. Shall we go home?" I said. Then he looked at me and smiled.
"I'm sorry," he said. "I should not have brought you up here. Yes, I have been here before, many years ago."
Those years seemed to stretch between us. For the first time, I wished that I had not come. De Winter turned the car carefully and we drove down the twisting road again. The sun was setting now and the air was cold and clear. Then at last, he began to talk about Mandalay. He did not talk about his life there, but about the house itself. He told me about the gardens and the flowers in the woods. He told me about the sea. It was so near that the sound of its waters could always be heard from the house. He told me about a little secret valley close to the sea. This little valley, hidden away from the world, was full of the scent of flowers. Then we were back in Monte Carlo. We drove slowly through the brightly lit streets towards the hotel. I took my gloves from the shelf of the car. There was a book there. I looked at it, trying to read the title.
"You can take the book and look at it if you like," De Winter said.
I was glad, and I held the book tightly in my hand. I wanted to have something of his now that our day was over.
"Out you get," he said. "I must put the car away. I won't see you tonight. I shall be out. But thank you for today."
I walked slowly up the hotel steps. I felt like a child going home after a party. I thought of the long hours to bedtime. I could not meet Mrs. Van Hopper and answer the endless questions. I went into the lounge and ordered tea. The waiter brought me tea that was nearly cold. The sandwiches were dry, but I ate them without thinking. In my mind, I was with Max de Winter at Mandalay. If he loved his home so much, why had he left it? I picked up the book he had given me. It was a book of poems. On the front page there was some writing, hard, clear writing in black ink. Max, from Rebecca, 17th of May. The name Rebecca stood out black and strong. The R was tall, much bigger than the other letters. I shut the book quickly. I remembered what Mrs. Van Hopper had told me about De Winter's wife.
"It was dreadful," she had said. "Her death was in all the newspapers. They say he never talks about it, never says her name. Rebecca was drowned, you know, in the sea near Mandalay."
I stood up slowly, the book in my hand. I walked unhappily to the lift and back to Mrs. Van Hopper. Chapter 3. In Love. I was 21, and De Winter was the first man I had ever loved. First love is not always happy. It can sometimes be like a terrible illness. Mrs. Van Hopper had been in bed for about 10 days. She was bored now and more bad-tempered than usual. She asked me what I had been doing.
"You haven't got enough to do, and so you're doing nothing," she said unpleasantly. "You never have any drawings to show me. When I ask you to do some shopping, you always forget something. You're getting lazy without me to watch you."
I did not reply. I could not tell Mrs. Van Hopper that every morning I drove with De Winter in his car. Every day I had lunch with him at his table. I have forgotten the places we went to, but I have not forgotten the excitement of those mornings. I remember how I ran down the stairs because the lift was too slow. He was always waiting in his car, reading the paper. When he saw me, he would smile and say,
"Well, how is the companion this morning? Where would you like to go?"
If we had driven round in circles, I would not have cared. I was happy to sit next to him, to be alone with him. But the time always went too quickly. There was a clock in the car. I could not help looking at it as we drove along. "If only we could keep our memories like scent in a bottle," I said one day, "and then we could open the bottle when we wanted to remember the moment again."
"And what moment would you like to keep?" De Winter said with a smile.
"I'm not sure," I began. Then I said quickly, "I'd like to keep this moment and never forget it." De Winter laughed. I suddenly felt very young and very silly. "I wish," I said angrily, "I wish I was a woman of about 36. I wish I was wearing a lot of makeup and had expensive clothes."
"You would not be in this car now if you were like that," he said.
"Why do you ask me to come out in your car day after day?" I said. "I'm young. I know nothing. I'm not an interesting person at all. You know all about me now. I've told you everything. But I know nothing about you, nothing, except that you live at Mandalay and that your wife is dead." I had said the words at last. Your wife. Your wife. He would never forgive me. I shall never drive with him again, I thought. He slowed down the car and we stopped by the side of the road. Then he turned to me and spoke. "A little while ago you said you wanted to keep your memories. For me, it is different. All my memories are unhappy. I want to forget them. Something happened a year ago that changed my whole life. I want to forget everything that happened to me before that time. That's why I came to Monte Carlo. If you had not been here, I would have left long ago. I ask you to drive with me because I like you. I enjoy your company. If you don't believe me, you can get out of the car now." I sat very still. I could not speak. I could feel the tears coming into my eyes. "I want to go home now," I said. Without a word, he started the car and we drove on. The tears began to run down my cheeks. Suddenly De Winter took my hand and kissed it. Then he gave me his handkerchief. I wiped my red eyes. I had never felt more alone. "To hell with this," he said, and put his arm round my shoulders. "You are so young, I don't know how to speak to you. Forget everything I told you. Let's start again. My family always call me Maxim. I'd like you to call me that too." I smiled then, and he laughed back at me. The morning was happy again. The afternoon with Mrs. Van Hopper did not matter. I could look forward to tomorrow morning and the morning after. I could call him Maxim. He had kissed me. I had to play cards with Mrs. Van Hopper that afternoon, but I was still happy. When we had finished our game, Mrs. Van Hopper said, "Tell me, is Max de Winter still in the hotel?" Yes, I think so. He comes into the restaurant sometimes," I said. Someone has told her, I thought. Someone has seen us together. I waited for her to ask more questions, but she did not. "He's an attractive man," she said, "but not easy to know. I never saw his wife. People say she was very lovely. She was clever, too, and always beautifully dressed, of course. Her death was very sudden. Everyone says he adored her." I did not answer. I was thinking about Rebecca, beautiful and clever. People could not forget her. Somehow she and her beauty had not died. In my bedroom was a book that Rebecca had held in her hands. His family called him Maxim. Rebecca had called him Max. I thought of the writing on that page. It was bold and full of life. Rebecca was all the things that I would never be. I thought of all the letters Rebecca had written to her husband. They must have been full of the life they had shared. I thought I could hear her voice calling him. She called him Max. It was her special name for him. And I had to call him Maxim. Chapter 4. I Leave Monte Carlo. 2 days later, everything had changed. Mrs. Van Hopper and I were ready to leave Monte Carlo. All the trunks and bags were packed. All the drawers and cupboards were empty. Mrs. Van Hopper had read a letter from her daughter at breakfast. "Helen is sailing for New York on Saturday. Her child's ill. We're going too. I'm tired of living here. How would you like to see New York?" The thought of leaving Monte Carlo and Maxim de Winter was a terrible one. My unhappiness must have shown on my face. "What a strange child you are," Mrs. Van Hopper said. "I can't understand you. I thought you didn't like Monte Carlo." "I've got used to it," I said. "Well, you'll have to get used to New York, that's all. We're going on the same boat as Helen. You'll have to arrange everything at once. Go down to the hotel office now. You'll be too busy to feel unhappy." She laughed unpleasantly at my sad face. She walked over to the telephone. She wanted to tell everyone that she was leaving. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I wanted to be alone for a few minutes. My happiness was at an end. By tomorrow evening I should be on the train. The train would carry me away from Maxim, mile by mile. He would be sitting in the restaurant, reading perhaps, and not thinking of me. Where would I say goodbye to him? In the lounge, with Mrs. Van Hopper standing near? I was going, and everything was over. We would say goodbye like two strangers. Mrs. Van Hopper knocked on the bathroom door.
"What are you doing in there?" she said. "There's no time to dream this morning. There's too much to be done."
I washed my face with cold water and came out of the bathroom at once. I spent the rest of the day packing and arranging the journey. In the evening, Mrs. Van Hopper's friends came to say goodbye. We had dinner upstairs, and Mrs. Van Hopper went to bed early. I had not seen Maxim all day. I went down to the lounge at 9:30. A waiter saw me. He knew who I was looking for, of course.
"Mr. De Winter is out this evening," he told me. "He will not be back before midnight."
I walked slowly back up the stairs. Tomorrow would be too late. I should not be able to speak to him at all. That night I cried. My pillow was wet with tears. In the morning my eyes were red and swollen.
"You haven't got a cold, have you?" said Mrs. Van Hopper when she saw my face.
"No," I said. "I don't think so." I tried not to look at her.
"I hate waiting around when everything is packed," Mrs. Van Hopper said bad-temperedly. "We ought to have gone on the earlier train."
She looked at her watch.
"I think we could still catch it. Go down to the reception desk and ask. Hurry up!"
So my last morning was to be taken away from me. I would not see Maxim. Suddenly, I made up my mind. Instead of going down to the reception desk, I ran up the stairs. I knew the number of his room. I knocked on the door.
"Come in,"
Maxim shouted. I opened the door. He was having breakfast at a small table in his sitting room. I stood by the door, feeling silly and awkward.
"What do you want?" he said. "Is something wrong?"
"I've come to say goodbye," I said. "We're going this morning. In about an hour. I thought I would not see you again." Maxim stared at me.
"Why didn't you tell me about this before?" he said.
"Mrs. Van Hopper only decided to leave yesterday. Her daughter sails for New York on Saturday and we're going with her. I don't want to go. I'll hate New York."
"Why go there, then?"
"I have to. I work for her, you know that. I can't afford to leave her."
"Sit down," he said. "Have some coffee."
"I haven't time," I told him. "I should be downstairs now."
"Never mind about that. I've got to talk to you."
I sat down at the table.
"So Mrs. Van Hopper wants to go home," said Maxim. "So do I. She goes to New York and I go to Mandalay. Which do you prefer? You can take your choice."
"Please don't joke about it," I said. "I must say goodbye now."
"I'm not joking," said Maxim. "Either you go to America with Mrs. Van Hopper, or you come home to Mandalay with me."
"Do you want a secretary?" I asked, not understanding him.
"No, I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool."
I sat with my hands in my lap, watching him drink his coffee. "You can't marry me," I said at last. "I'm different from you. I don't belong to your kind of world. I don't belong to a place like Mandalay."
"What do you know about Mandalay?" Maxim said. "I want you to marry me. Are you going to?"
I sat there staring at him. I could not think clearly.
"The idea doesn't seem to please you," Maxim said. "I'm sorry. I thought you loved me."
"I do love you," I said. "I do. I've been crying all night. I thought I would never see you again." When I said this, Maxim laughed and put his hand over mine.
"One day I'll remind you of those words. It's a pity you have to grow up," he said.
Was Maxim laughing at me? Was it all a joke? He saw the look on my face.
"I haven't done this very well, have I?" Maxim said. "Men don't usually propose at breakfast, but I'll take you to Venice for our honeymoon. We'll travel round Italy for a time. Then in the spring we'll go back to Mandalay. I want to show you Mandalay so much."
Maxim wanted to show me Mandalay. Suddenly I believed everything. I would be Maxim's wife. We would walk in the gardens of Mandalay together. We would walk through that hidden valley to the sea. Mrs. De Winter. I would be Mrs. De Winter.
"Am I going to tell Mrs. Van Hopper, or are you?" said Maxim with a smile.
I had forgotten all about Mrs. Van Hopper. "You tell her," I said. "She'll be so angry." We got up from the table and walked out of the room together. Maxim took my hand.
"I'm 42, he said. "That must seem very old to you."
"Oh, no," I said. "I don't like young men." I was still afraid that Maxim would change his mind. We came to the door of Mrs. Van Hopper's rooms.
"I think I'll talk to her alone," Maxim said. "I'll tell her we are getting married very soon. We'll have a quiet wedding. Everything can be arranged in a few days."
"Of course," I said. "I don't want a lot of fuss." I opened the door.
"Is that you?" called Mrs. Van Hopper. "Where have you been? What have you been doing all this time?"
I did not know whether to laugh or cry. Maxim walked towards the sitting room.
"I'm afraid it's all my fault," he said, and then he shut the door.
I went into my bedroom and waited. I wondered what Maxim was saying to Mrs. Van Hopper. Was he saying, "I love her. I want to marry her at once"? Love. Maxim had not said anything to me about love. He had said we would get married, but he had not said that he loved me. He had loved Rebecca, of course. How could he love me after her? I would be a companion for him, someone to make him laugh, perhaps. The book of poems was beside me on the bed. I opened it. I read again. Max, from Rebecca. She was dead, but the writing still looked fresh and alive. I took some scissors and cut the page out of the book. I tore up the page. I lit a match and set fire to the pieces. The paper twisted, blackened, and turned to ashes. The letter R was the last to be burnt. Then the flame destroyed it. I washed my hands. I felt better. Much better now. As I stood there, the door opened and Maxim came in.
"Everything is all right," he said. "She could not speak at first. She was too surprised. Go in and talk to her. I'm going downstairs to arrange about her train. I don't want her to come to the wedding."
Maxim was smiling, but he said nothing about being happy. He said nothing about love. I walked slowly into Mrs. Van Hopper's bedroom. She was standing by the window, smoking a cigarette. She turned round and looked at me carefully.
"Well," she said, "you are more clever than I thought. How did you do it?"
I did not know what to say. Mrs. Van Hopper was smiling, but there was no kindness in her smile.
"It was lucky for you that I was ill," she said. "You certainly made the most of your time. He tells me that he wants to marry you in a few days. Well, I can't stop you. He's much older than you know."
"He's only 42, I said. "I know what I'm doing." Mrs. Van Hopper looked at me again with the same unpleasant smile.
"I hope you do. You won't find it easy to look after Manderley. You haven't any experience and you're too shy. Max de Winter is very attractive, of course, but I think you're making a big mistake."
I did not say anything. I was young and shy, I knew that. But I was going to be Mrs. De Winter. I was going to live at Mandalay, and I was going to make Maxim happy. Mrs. Van Hopper put out her cigarette. She walked slowly towards me.
"Of course," she said. "You know why he's marrying you, don't you? He's not in love with you. The truth is, he's lonely by himself at Mandalay. He can't live in that empty house without Rebecca. He's marrying you because he can't go on living there alone."
Chapter 5. I Come to Mandalay. We came to Mandalay early in May. It was the best time of year, before the heat of summer. When we left London, it was raining hard. I remember Maxim saying, "This is London rain. The sun will be shining for you when we come to Mandalay." He was right. Long before we reached Mandalay, there was blue sky over our heads. I was glad to see the sun. I welcomed it as a sign of happiness. "Feeling better?" said Maxim, looking at me. I smiled at him and took his hand. It was so easy for Maxim. He was going back to his own home. But for me, everything was new and strange. I was going to Mandalay for the first time, and I was going there as the second wife of Maxim de Winter. "Only 2 more miles," said Maxim at last. "Can you see those trees on the hill in front of us? Mandalay is in the valley beyond those trees." I tried to smile, but suddenly I felt lonely and afraid. I was like a child on her first day at school. Turning a corner, we came to a crossroads and the beginning of a high wall. "Here we are," Maxim said. "Mandalay at last." I could hear the excitement in his voice. The road turned again. On the left were 2 high iron gates, and beside them a small lodge. The gates were wide open for us. People were looking out of the windows of the lodge. They were looking at me. I sat back in my seat. I wanted to hide from their curious eyes. "You mustn't mind if people stare at you," Maxim said. "They are all very interested in you. Don't worry. Be yourself, and everyone at Mandalay will love you. Mrs. Danvers looks after the house. She's been housekeeper here for years. Leave everything to her. She may be rather strange at first, but don't worry about that. She will soon get used to you." We were going along the drive now that led up to the house. The drive turned and twisted like a snake. The tall trees met over our heads. Only a little sunlight came through their thick branches. Everything was very quiet. On and on we went. Then suddenly the trees came to an end. The sun shone again. Beautiful high bushes covered with bright red flowers stood on either side of us. We were not far from the house now. The drive widened. We turned the last corner, and there was Mandalay. The old house was perfect. It was built in a small hollow, and its grey stones glowed in the sunlight. Smooth green lawns surrounded the house. Beyond the lawns were gardens, and beyond the gardens, the sea. Maxim drove up to the wide stone steps and stopped the car in front of them. At the top of the steps, a big door stood wide open. I saw that the hall beyond was full of people. I could see their faces all turned towards us. I was suddenly shy and afraid again. "What's the matter?" I said. "Who are all those people?" "I'm sorry," Maxim said. "This must be Mrs. Danvers' idea. Everyone who works at Mandalay is here. Don't look so frightened. You won't have to say anything. I'll do it all." An old man with a kind face came down the steps. "Well, here we are, Frith," said Maxim. "Everyone well?" "Yes, thank you, sir," said Frith. "We are all very glad to see you at home again. We hope you're well. And Madam, too, of course." "Yes, we are both well, thank you, Frith. But we're tired from the drive and we want our tea. I didn't expect all these people." "Mrs. Danvers' orders, sir," said Frith. "I thought so," Maxim said. "Come on," he said to me. "It won't take long, and then you can have your tea in peace." We went together up the wide stone steps. Inside the open door, the servants stood in 2 lines. A tall, thin woman, dressed in black, came towards us. Her pale, thin face was hard. There was no welcome in her dark eyes. The hand she placed in mine was cold and heavy, like something dead. "This is Mrs. Danvers, our housekeeper," said Maxim. The woman began to speak in a cold, lifeless voice. I remember nothing of what she said. I suppose she was welcoming me to Mandalay. As I thanked her, Mrs. Danvers looked at me with her hard, dark eyes. I dropped my gloves on the floor, and Mrs. Danvers picked them up with a twisted little smile on her lips. She could see that I was awkward and shy, and a little afraid of my new life at Mandalay. Maxim noticed nothing. He thanked Mrs. Danvers quickly and took me into the library for tea. We were alone at last. A dog ran up from the fireside to greet us. He went first to Maxim, and then sat down beside me. I was glad of the dog's friendly welcome. The library was a large, comfortable room. Its walls were covered with books from the floor to the ceiling. Comfortable chairs stood on either side of a great open fireplace. From its long windows I could see the lawns, and beyond the lawns the sea. There was a quiet peace in the room. It was a place for rest, for reading, and for quiet thinking. Tea was brought to us by Frith and a younger servant. There was a special table and a snow-white cloth to cover it. The teapot and kettle were of silver, and the china was very fine. There were sandwiches, bread and butter, and several kinds of cake. There was far too much food for 2 people, but this was the tea served at Mandalay every day. Maxim sat in a chair by the fire reading the letters that had been waiting for him. Now and again he looked up at me and smiled. I leant back in my chair, drinking my tea and trying to feel at home. It was true. Mandalay was my home now. My home and Maxim's. But somehow I still could not believe it. My thoughts were interrupted by the opening of the door. It was Frith.
"Excuse me, madam," he said. "Mrs. Danvers asked if you would like to see your room."
Maxim looked up from his letters.
"What do the rooms in the East Wing look like now?" he said.
"Very nice indeed, sir," Frith replied. "I think you will be very comfortable there."
"Have you been making changes?" I asked.
"Oh, nothing much," said Maxim. "They've been getting the rooms in the East Wing ready for us. There's a lovely view of the rose garden from there. You go and make friends with Mrs. Danvers. I'll come up later."
I got up slowly and went out with Frith into the hall. I did not want to be alone with Mrs. Danvers. The hall seemed very big, and my footsteps sounded very loud on the stone floor. Mrs. Danvers was standing at the top of the wide flight of stairs. Her dark eyes watched me as I walked slowly up the stairs towards her. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting," I said.
"It is my duty to wait for you, madam," Mrs. Danvers said. "I am here to carry out your orders."
She led me along a wide passage. We passed through doors and up and down wide stairs. At last Mrs. Danvers opened a door leading into a small room. This room led into a large, light bedroom with wide windows. I went at once to a window and looked out. The rose garden lay below me. Beyond the rose garden, the smooth grass stretched to the woods. "You can't see the sea from here," I said, turning to Mrs. Danvers.
"No, not from this wing," she answered. "And you can't hear it either. You would never know the sea was so near."
Mrs. Danvers spoke in a strange way, as though this was somehow important to her. "I'm sorry about that. I like the sea," I said. "But this is a very charming room. I'm sure I shall be comfortable here."
"Mr. De Winter gave very careful orders in his letter about this room. The rooms here have been specially arranged for you."
"Then this was not his bedroom before?"
"Oh, no, madam. He has never used this room."
There was silence. I did not know what to say. I wished Mrs. Danvers would go away. "I suppose you have been at Mandalay for many years," I said.
"Yes, madam. I came here when the first Mrs. De Winter was a bride."
Her voice was suddenly harsh. There was some colour in her pale face now, and for a moment I saw a look of hatred in her eyes. "Mrs. Danvers," I heard myself saying, "I hope we shall be friends. This sort of life is new to me. I do want to make Mr. De Winter happy. I know I can leave the housekeeping to you. I shan't want to make any changes."
"Very well," she said. "I hope you will be satisfied. I have been looking after the house for the past year. When the late Mrs. De Winter was alive, there were lots of parties and visitors, of course. She liked to look after everything herself."
"I would rather leave it to you, Mrs. Danvers," I said, "and I'm sure we'll be very comfortable in these rooms."
"Mr. De Winter said you would rather be on this side of the house. They used the rooms in the West Wing when Mrs. De Winter was alive. The windows there look down to the sea."
There was a sound outside the door, and Mrs. Danvers stopped talking. Maxim came into the room.
"Well, what do you think?" Maxim said to me. "I hope you like the rooms. I think you've done very well, Mrs. Danvers."
"Thank you, sir,"
she said. Then she turned and went quietly out of the room. Maxim walked to the window.
"I love the rose garden," he said. "There's something very quiet and peaceful about this room. How did you get on with Mrs. Danvers? She's a strange woman in many ways. I think that some of the young servants are afraid of her."
"I expect we'll get on well when she knows me better," I said. "She may not like me at first, of course."
"Not like you? Why shouldn't she like you?" said Maxim.
and he came across the room and kissed me gently.
"Let's forget about Mrs. Danvers," he said. "Come along, and I'll show you Mandalay."
I felt happier as I walked through the house with Maxim. We looked at the pictures in the long gallery, and at most of the rooms downstairs. Maxim put his arm round my shoulder. I began to feel that Mandalay really was my home. After dinner we sat in the library. The curtains were drawn and more logs put on the fire. It was new for us to sit together quietly like this. In Italy we had walked about in the evenings or gone for a drive. Maxim sat in the chair to the left of the fireplace. He picked up the paper. He put a cushion behind his head and lit a cigarette. This is what he always did, I thought. This is what he did before he knew me. It is what he has done every evening for years. Maxim did not look at me. He went on reading his paper. He was comfortable, the master of his house. I poured myself another cup of coffee. I bent down to the dog and stroked its soft ears. Suddenly I shivered, as though a door had opened behind me. Someone else had sat in my chair. Someone else had poured coffee and stroked the dog. I was sitting in Rebecca's chair. I was leaning against Rebecca's cushion. The dog Jasper came to me because in the past he had come to Rebecca. Chapter 6. In the Morning Room. Life at Mandalay was very carefully planned. The same things happened at the same time every day. I remember our first morning there very clearly. I had slept well and came downstairs a little after 9 o'clock. To my surprise, I found that Maxim had nearly finished his breakfast. Maxim looked up at me and smiled.
"I always get up early here," he said. "Looking after Mandalay takes a lot of my time. I work very hard, but you don't have to. Help yourself to anything you want."
I remember the size of that breakfast. It was the normal Mandalay breakfast, but far too much for 2 people. As I took an egg and some coffee, I wondered what happened to the food that was left. Would it be eaten or thrown away? I would never know, of course. I would certainly be too afraid to ask.
"My sister Beatrice is coming over to lunch with her husband," Maxim told me. "She invited herself, of course. I suppose she wants to have a look at you."
"They're coming today?" I said, feeling less happy than before.
"Yes, but she won't stay long. I think you'll like Beatrice. She believes in telling the truth. If she doesn't like you, she'll tell you so."
Maxim stood up and lit a cigarette.
"I've so many things to do this morning. Why don't you go into the garden? You don't mind being alone, do you?"
"Of course not," I said. "I should be perfectly happy." But I did not feel very happy as Maxim walked out of the room. I had thought we would spend our first morning at Mandalay together. I had thought that perhaps we would walk down to the sea or sit under the great tree on the lawn. I finished my breakfast alone. I left the dining room and went into the library. The room was cold. The fire was laid but not lit. I looked round for a box of matches, but I could not find one. I went across the hall and into the dining room once more. Yes, there was a box of matches on the table. I picked it up. At that moment Frith came into the room. "Oh, Frith," I said awkwardly, "I could not find any matches. I thought I would light the fire in the library. It's rather cold in there."
"The fire in the library is not usually lit until the afternoon, madam," he said. "Mrs. De Winter always used the morning room before lunch. There's a good fire in there. Of course, I can give orders for the fire in the library to be lit."
"Oh, no," I said. "I'll go into the morning room. Thank you, Frith."
"Mrs. De Winter always wrote her letters in the morning room after breakfast. The house telephone is there too if you want to talk to Mrs. Danvers."
"Thank you, Frith," I said. I went into the hall again. I did not know which way to go. I could not tell Frith that I had never seen the morning room. Maxim had not shown it to me the night before.
"You go through the drawing room to the morning room, madam," Frith said, watching me. "Then turn to your left."
"Thank you, Frith," I said. I felt very stupid. I found my way into the little morning room. I was glad to see the dog Jasper there, sitting in front of the fire. The morning room was quite small and very different from the library. It was a woman's room, graceful and charming. Someone had chosen everything in this room with the greatest care. Each chair, each rug, each small ornament had been put there to make the room perfect. Flowers filled the room, glowing blood-red flowers. They were the same flowers we had seen in the drive. A beautiful old writing desk stood near the window. I went over and opened the desk carefully. Every drawer was labelled, and everything was in order. Inside one of the drawers was a flat leather book, Guests at Mandalay. I opened the book. The writing inside the book and the writing on the labels was the same. I had seen that tall, sloping writing before. It was Rebecca's writing. This was Rebecca's desk. I sat down and opened the guest book. Every page was covered with the same writing. I felt that Rebecca would come back into the room at any moment. The mistress of the house would come in and find me, a stranger, sitting at her desk. Suddenly the telephone on the desk began to ring. My heart jumped. I picked up the phone. "Who is it?" I said. "Who do you want?"
"Mrs. De Winter," said a hard, deep voice. "Mrs. De Winter."
My hand was shaking. "I'm afraid you've made a mistake," I said. "Mrs. De Winter has been dead for over a year." I suddenly realised what I had said.
"It's Mrs. Danvers, madam," said the voice. "I'm speaking to you on the house telephone."
"I'm so sorry, Mrs. Danvers," I said. "I didn't know what I was saying. I did not expect the telephone to ring."
"I wondered if you had seen the menus for the day. You will find the list on the desk beside you."
I found the piece of paper and looked at it quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Danvers, yes, very nice indeed."
"I'm very sorry to have disturbed you, madam."
"You didn't disturb me at all. Thank you, Mrs. Danvers," I said. I put down the phone and looked at the desk. I felt very stupid. Rebecca would not have answered like that. I thought of Rebecca sitting at that desk. Here she had chosen her guests and written letters to her friends. Who could I write to? I knew nobody. Then I thought of Mrs. Van Hopper, far away in New York. I took a piece of paper and a pen. "Dear Mrs. Van Hopper," I began. As I wrote, I noticed my own handwriting for the first time. How weak and childish it was. It was like the writing of a schoolgirl. Chapter 7. You Are So Very Different. When I heard the sound of a car in the drive, I stood up in sudden fear. Beatrice and her husband had arrived. They were earlier than I expected, and Maxim had not come back. I could not meet them by myself. I ran quickly out of the morning room. I took a door to the left. I was in a stone corridor. A servant stared at me in surprise. I hurried up some stairs, hoping that I could find my way to my bedroom in the east wing. I could stay there until Maxim came back. Somehow I lost my way, but I went on and came to a wide staircase. I went up it. All was quiet and dark. I was in a corridor with doors on either side. I walked on, and at last I came to a long window. I looked out. Below me I could see green lawns and the sea. The sea was bright green with white-topped waves. It was closer than I thought, much closer. I knew then that I had walked right round the house. I was standing in the corridor of the west wing. Yes, Mrs. Danvers was right. You could hear the sea from here. I was glad that my rooms were in the east wing. I loved the quiet beauty of the rose garden. The sea was too near here. As I turned to go back to the stairs, I heard a door open behind me. Mrs. Danvers stood there. We stared at one another for a moment without speaking. "I lost my way," I said. "I was trying to find my room."
"This is the west wing," she said. "Did you go into any of the rooms? If you wish to see them, please tell me. I could show them to you now."
I shook my head. No, thank you," I said. "I must go downstairs." As I began to walk towards the stairs, Mrs. Danvers followed me.
"If you want to see the rooms in the west wing, I can show them to you at any time."
"It's very kind of you, Mrs. Danvers," I said. "I will let you know." Mrs. Danvers walked beside me.
Major and Mrs. Lacey have been here some time, she said. Didn't you hear their car? Frith took them to the morning room. I think you know your way now, don't you?
Yes, Mrs. Danvers, I said.
I knew then that she had been watching me, laughing at my fear.
As I went into the drawing room, I looked back. Mrs. Danvers was still watching me from the top of the stairs. I could hear the sound of voices from the morning room. I stood for a moment and then walked in.
Here she is at last, Maxim said. Where have you been hiding? Here's Beatrice, and this is Giles, and this is Frank Crawley, our agent.
Beatrice was tall, broad-shouldered, and very much like Maxim. She shook hands with me and said to Maxim,
She's quite different from what I expected. Not like your description at all.
Everyone laughed, but they seemed friendly. Giles was a big, heavy man. His eyes smiled at me from behind his thick glasses. Frank Crawley was a thin man with a pleasant, worried face. Maxim had told me how hard Frank Crawley worked for Mandalay. The men began to talk together, and I had to answer Beatrice's questions.
What do you think of Mandalay?
She asked me. I haven't seen much of it yet, I said. The house is beautiful, of course. I haven't seen the gardens, but I'm sure I shall never get tired of them. I love walking. I can swim, too, when the weather is warmer.
My dear, the water is always far too cold here, said Beatrice.
I don't mind that. I love swimming. Is it safe to swim in the bays? Everyone stopped talking. I realised what I had said. Rebecca had been drowned in the bay. I could not look at Maxim. I bent down to stroke the dog's head. Then, thank God, Frith came in to say that lunch was ready. Beatrice walked with me through the hall.
You know, she said, you're much younger than I expected. Tell me, do you love Maxim very much?
Beatrice looked at my surprised face and laughed.
Don't answer, she said. I can see that you do. Maxim looks very well. We were all very worried about him last year, but of course you know the whole story.
But Beatrice was wrong. I did not know what had happened down in the bay. Maxim had told me nothing. I had never asked him about Rebecca's death. Beatrice talked to Maxim all through lunch. Frank Crawley told me a lot about Mandalay. I could see that he loved it as much as Maxim did. When lunch was over, I could see that Maxim was tired. I wished we hadn't had visitors so soon. I took Beatrice out onto the terrace. She asked me how I had met Maxim. I told her about Mrs. Van Hopper and how surprised she had been.
It was rather a shock to us, too, Beatrice said. Maxim said in his letter that you were very young and pretty. We expected a very modern sort of girl.
Beatrice laughed, and I laughed with her.
Poor Maxim. He had a terrible time,
Beatrice said.
Let's hope you have made him forget all about it. He loves Mandalay so much, but you never know what he is thinking. How do you get on with Mrs. Danvers?
I was surprised by Beatrice's question. She frightens me a little, I said.
She may try to make things unpleasant for you, Beatrice went on. She's very jealous, of course. She must hate you being here.
Why? I asked. Why must she hate me being at Mandalay?
My dear child, Beatrice answered slowly. I thought Maxim had told you. Mrs. Danvers adored Rebecca. She still does.
At that moment the men came out of the house. A servant brought rugs and chairs, and we all sat under the great tree on the lawn. I hoped everyone would go soon. I wanted to be alone with Maxim. I was sitting on a rug, leaning against Maxim's chair. I listened to the others talking. The afternoon was sleepy and peaceful. Everything was quiet and still. Even the sea seemed far away. This is what I wanted, I thought. This is how I thought life at Mandalay would be. This moment was safe. It could not be touched. Here we sat together, Maxim and I, hand in hand. The past and the future did not matter at all. At this moment I was not afraid. The moment passed. Beatrice stood up.
We must be going, she said. We've got people coming to dinner.
We all got up and Giles looked up at the sky.
I'm afraid we're going to have some rain, he said.
We all walked slowly back to the drive. Beatrice took my hand, then she bent down and kissed me.
Forgive me if I've asked you a lot of rude questions, my dear. As I said before, you're not what we expected. You're so very different from Rebecca."
As we reached the car, the sun went behind a cloud and a little rain began to fall. Maxim and I watched the car drive away. We turned and walked back into the house. Chapter 8. The Happy Valley. As we stood in the hall, Maxim put his arm around my shoulders.
"Thank God that's over," he said. "Get a coat quickly and let's go out. Never mind the rain, I want to walk."
Maxim looked white and ill. Had Beatrice said something to make him angry? I could not remember. "Just a moment," I said. "I'll get my coat from upstairs."
"There are plenty of raincoats downstairs," Maxim said. "Robert, will you fetch a coat for Mrs. De Winter?"
Maxim was standing in the drive now, calling to Jasper.
"Come on, you lazy little fellow, you're too fat."
Jasper ran round in circles, barking loudly. The young servant, Robert, ran out of the hall carrying a raincoat. I put it on quickly. It was too big, of course, and too long, but Maxim was waiting impatiently and there was no time to change the coat. We set off together across the lawns to the woods. Jasper ran on in front.
"I soon get tired of my family," Maxim said. "Beatrice is very kind-hearted, but she always says the wrong thing."
I was not sure what Beatrice had said, and I thought it better not to ask.
"What did you think of Beatrice?" Maxim asked me. "What did she talk to you about after lunch?"
"I think I did most of the talking," I said. "I was telling her about how we met. She said I was quite different from what she expected."
"What on earth did she expect?"
"Someone much smarter, I think. A modern young woman." Maxim did not answer. He bent down and threw a stick for Jasper to run after. We climbed the grass bank above the lawns and walked down into the woods. The trees grew very close together over our heads and it was very dark. We walked on last year's leaves. The green shoots of flowers were beginning to show through. Jasper was silent now, with his nose to the ground. We came to a clearing in the woods. There were two paths, going in opposite directions. Jasper ran on ahead and took the right-hand path without waiting for us.
"Not that way," called Maxim. "Come on, old boy."
The dog looked back at us. He stood there wagging his tail. "Why does he want to go that way?" I asked.
"I suppose he's used to it," Maxim said quickly. "It leads to a small bay where we used to keep a boat. Come on, Jasper, old boy, this way."
We turned onto the left-hand path, not saying anything. I looked over my shoulder and saw that Jasper was following us.
"This path brings us to the valley I told you about," Maxim told me. "You can smell the flowers already. Never mind the rain, it will bring out the scent."
Maxim seemed all right again now, happy and cheerful. He began talking about Frank Crawley. He told me what a good agent he was and how he loved Mandalay. I held Maxim's arm and looked up into his face. Talking about Mandalay always made Maxim happy again. We had reached the top of a small hill. The path ran down into a little valley by the side of a stream.
"There," said Maxim. "Look at that."
There were no dark trees in this valley, no thick bushes. On either side of the narrow path stood high, graceful bushes covered with flowers. The flowers were pink, white, and gold. They were things of beauty and grace. The soft summer rain fell and the air was full of a sweet scent. There was no sound except for the noise of a little stream and the quiet rain on the leaves. When Maxim spoke, his voice was gentle and low.
"We call it the Happy Valley," he said.
We stood still, not speaking. I looked down at the clear white flowers. Maxim picked up a fallen flower and gave it to me. As I rubbed it between my hands, the scent was sweet and strong. A bird began to sing, a high, clear sound. Other birds began to sing too. I had never been in so beautiful a place. As we walked along the path, drops of rain fell on my hands and face. I held Maxim's hand. The Happy Valley was the heart of Mandalay, the Mandalay I would soon know and love.
Chapter 9. The Cottage in the Bay. We came to the end of the path. The bushes made an arch over our heads so that we had to bend down. I stood straight again, brushing the rain from my head. I saw that the valley was behind us. We were standing in a little narrow bay. There, almost at our feet, was the sea. Maxim looked down at me, smiling at the surprise on my face.
"It is a surprise, isn't it?" he said. "No one ever expects it."
Maxim picked up a stone and threw it across the beach for Jasper.
"Fetch it, good boy," he said.
Jasper ran after the stone, barking with excitement. We both went down to the water's edge and threw more stones. The tide was coming up into the bay and the water was beginning to cover the stones. Maxim turned to me, laughing and wiping the hair out of his eyes. I rolled up the long sleeves of the raincoat. It was a happy moment. Then we saw that Jasper had gone. We called and whistled, but he did not come. "Has he gone back to the Happy Valley?" I asked.
"He was by that rock a minute ago," said Maxim.
We walked up the beach towards the valley again.
"Jasper! Jasper!" called Maxim.
In the distance, beyond a line of rocks to the right of the beach, I heard a sharp bark. "Do you hear that?" "He's gone over this way." I began to climb up the wet rocks.
"Come back," Maxim said sharply. "We don't want to go that way."
"I must get him," I said. "He may be hurt."
"He's all right," said Maxim. "Leave him. He knows the way home."
I began climbing over the rocks towards Jasper. I thought Maxim was being very unkind. I got to the top of the largest rock and looked beyond it. There was another bay. A small stone wall across the bay made it into a small harbour. In the bay was a green and white buoy, but no boat. The woods came right down to the shore. At the edge of the woods was a low stone building, a cottage or a boathouse. There was a man standing on the shore dressed like a fisherman. Jasper was barking at him and running round and round. The man took no notice of the dog. "Jasper!" I shouted. "Jasper, come here!" The dog looked up, but he did not come to me. I looked back, but I could not see Maxim. I climbed down into the bay, and the man looked at me for the first time. There was something strange about him. He had small, stupid-looking eyes. His face was fat and round, and he had thick red lips.
"Bad weather, isn't it?"
the man said with a stupid smile. "It's not very nice weather," I said. "Come on, Jasper. We must go home now." But Jasper ran away, barking. "Have you got any string?" I asked the man. "I want something to tie the dog. He won't follow me."
"I know that dog. It's not yours. It comes from the house."
"He's Mr. De Winter's dog," I said kindly. "I must take him back." The man said nothing, but stared at me in the same stupid way. I walked up the shore to the cottage. Perhaps there was some string there. The grass round the little house had grown very long. The windows had pieces of wood over them. I pushed at the door. To my surprise, it opened, and I went inside. The room was furnished, and there were books on the shelves, but everything was covered with thick dust. The air was damp and still. Another door at the end of the room led into a small boathouse. I saw some string on a shelf and an old knife. I cut a piece of string for Jasper and went out of the cottage. There was something frightening about that small, dark room. I was glad to be outside again. The man was still watching me, staring like a child. Jasper was quiet now, and let me tie the string.
"I saw you go in there,"
the man said.
"She doesn't go in there now. She's gone in the sea. She won't come back, will she?"
"No," I said. "She won't come back."
"I didn't say anything, did I?"
The man's eyes were full of fear. He turned away and walked back towards the sea. Maxim was waiting for me beside the rocks. He looked angry. "I'm sorry," I said. "I had to get some string for Jasper. Who is that man?"
"That's Ben. He's a bit mad, but he won't hurt you. Where did you get that string?"
"I found it in the cottage. The door was open. There's dust everywhere. The place ought to be cleaned."
"The door should be locked," Maxim said.
He was walking very fast now.
He went up past the cottage and onto the path through the woods. It was very different here from the Happy Valley. The path was steep and the trees were thick and dark. It was cold now, and my legs ached. Jasper was tired too and walked very slowly.
"Come on, Jasper, for God's sake," said Maxim angrily. "Pull at that string, can't you?" he said to me.
"It's your fault," I said. "You walk so fast."
"If you had listened to me, we would be home by now. There was no need for you to go after Jasper."
"I thought you would come with me," I answered.
"Why should I run after the damned dog?" Maxim said, not looking at me.
"That's an excuse. You didn't want to go over the rocks," I answered.
"All right, I didn't. I didn't want to go to the other bay. I never go near the place or that damned cottage. If you had my memories, you would not go there either. You wouldn't talk about it or even think about it."
Maxim's face was white. His eyes had a dark, lost look. I took his hand and held it tight. "Please, Maxim, please," I said. "I don't want you to look like that. I'm sorry, darling. Please don't let us quarrel."
"We should have stayed in Italy," Maxim said. "I was a fool to bring you back to Mandalay."
I had to run to keep up with him now. At last we came to the top of the path and out onto the lawn. Maxim's face was hard. He walked straight into the house and spoke to Frith.
"We want tea at once," said Maxim.
Then he went quickly into the library and shut the door. I tried to keep back my tears. Frith must not see them. I turned away as he helped me off with the raincoat. He picked up a handkerchief.
"Is this yours, madam?" he said.
I put the handkerchief in my pocket and walked slowly across the hall to the library. Maxim was sitting in his usual chair with Jasper at his feet. I walked across the room and knelt down by Maxim's chair. "Don't be angry with me any more," I said. Maxim looked down at me.
"I'm not angry with you," he said.
"But I've made you unhappy," I replied. "I want you to be happy so much. I love you."
"Do you?"
he said. His eyes were full of pain and fear. "What is it, darling?" I said. "Why do you look like that?" The door opened before Maxim could answer. It was Frith and Robert with the tea. The small table was put near the fire and covered with the white cloth. Frith brought in the silver teapot and kettle. Then came the cups, the sandwiches and cakes. Everything was the same as yesterday. When the servants had gone, I looked at Maxim's face. The colour had come back into it. He took a sandwich.
"Pour me a cup of tea, darling," he said to me, "and forgive me for being so unkind."
There was nothing more to say. Maxim smiled at me and picked up his paper. Maxim's smile was like a pat on the head given to Jasper. I was not hungry and I felt very tired. I gave Jasper a piece of cake and took out the handkerchief to wipe my hands. The handkerchief was not mine. It must have come from the raincoat pocket. There were some letters in the corner, a tall R and DW. It was Rebecca's. The raincoat, too wide, too long for me, must have been hers too. Rebecca had worn that raincoat. She had left the handkerchief in the pocket. I could smell a scent I knew. I shut my eyes and tried to remember what it was. Suddenly I knew. The scent on the handkerchief was the scent of the flowers in the Happy Valley. Was there nowhere I could escape from Rebecca? Chapter 10. Questions and Answers. The weather was wet and cold for over a week. We did not go down to the beach again. I could see the sea from the terrace and the lawns. It looked cold and grey. When I stood on the terrace, I could hear the sound of great waves on the shore. I began to understand why some people hated the low, angry voice of the sea. I was glad that our rooms were in the east wing. If I could not sleep, I went to the window and looked out onto the rose garden. I was not troubled by the sea's unhappy music. Sometimes I thought about the cottage down in the bay. There were so many questions I wanted to ask Maxim. I could not forget the lost look in Maxim's eyes. I could not forget his words. I was a fool to bring you back to Mandalay. It was all my fault. I had gone down into the bay. I had reminded Maxim of the past. We lived our lives together, sleeping, eating, walking. But every hour of the day, the past made a wall between us. I became nervous and afraid. I did not want anyone to talk about the sea or boats. When visitors came to Mandalay, I was shy and awkward. I knew that they compared me with Rebecca. She had been charming, interested in everyone. I was dull and stupid like a schoolgirl. One afternoon, I was having tea alone when the wife of the bishop called. She was a kind woman and tried hard to make me talk. At last she said, "Will your husband hold the Mandalay fancy dress ball this year? I remember the last one so well. It was such a lovely sight. I shall never forget it." I smiled and said, "We have not decided. There have been so many things to do." I could not tell the woman that Maxim had never spoken about the ball.
"Mandalay looked so beautiful," the bishop's wife went on, "and there was dancing and music and flowers everywhere."
"Yes," I said. "Yes. I must ask Maxim about it."
"We came to a garden party too one summer," the bishop's wife went on. "It was a lovely day. We all had tea in the rose garden. It was such a clever idea. Of course, she was a clever person."
She stopped, her face rather red. I heard myself saying, "Rebecca must have been a wonderful person." I had said her name at last. Rebecca. I had said it aloud.
"You never met her then?" the woman asked. "Oh, yes, she was a lovely person, so full of life. Everyone loved her."
"She was so good at everything too," I said. "Clever, beautiful, and fond of sport."
"Rebecca was certainly beautiful," my visitor went on. "I remember her on the night of the ball. She had a cloud of dark hair. Her skin was very white, and she had such a lovely dress."
"She looked after everything in the house too," I said. "I'm afraid I leave it all to the housekeeper."
"Oh, well, you are very young, aren't you? We can't all do everything. I must go now. Do ask your husband to have another ball."
"Yes, of course I will." I sat in the library after my visitor had gone. I thought about Mandalay, full of people in beautiful costumes, dancing in the hall. I thought of Rebecca, lively and beautiful, arranging everything. What must people think about me? I suddenly sat up straight. I did not mind. I did not care. I was Mrs. De Winter now, not Rebecca. I decided that I would find out more about the fancy dress ball, but I did not want to ask Maxim. Later that afternoon, Frank Crawley came up to the house. "I've been hearing about the fancy dress ball, Frank," I said. "I did not know you had dances here." Frank did not reply at once. Then he said,
"The Mandalay ball was held every year. People came from miles around. They even came down from London."
"It must have been a lot of work," I said. "I suppose Rebecca did most of it." Frank looked straight ahead.
"We all helped," he said.
"Will you ask Maxim about the ball?" I asked. "It does seem a good idea." Frank did not answer me. "I went into that cottage in the bay a few days ago," I said. "It's very dirty. Why doesn't someone do something about it?"
"Maxim would tell me if he wanted anything done," Frank replied.
"Are they Rebecca's things?" I asked.
"Yes,"
Frank said. "Did Rebecca use the cottage a lot?"
"Yes, she did. She slept in the cottage sometimes. She had moonlight picnics on the shore."
I noticed that Frank always called Rebecca she. He never used her name. "Why is there a buoy in the bay?" I asked. "There's no boat there. What happened to it? Was it the boat Rebecca was sailing when she died?"
"Yes,"
said Frank quietly.
"It turned over and sank. She was washed overboard and drowned. The sea is sometimes very rough in the bay."
"Couldn't anyone have helped her?" I asked.
"Nobody saw the accident. Nobody knew she was sailing. She often went out alone like that."
When did they find her? I felt I must know everything now. I had been thinking about that terrible night for so long.
They found her 2 months later. The sea had carried her 40 miles up the coast. Maxim had to identify the body.
Suddenly I was ashamed of all my questions. Frank, I said, I'm sorry I asked you all those questions. But everything is so strange to me at Mandalay. And when I meet anyone new, I know what they're thinking. How different she is from Rebecca.
Mrs. De Winter, you mustn't think that, said Frank, looking at me for the first time. I am so glad you have married Maxim. It will make such a difference to his life. And Mandalay needs someone like you, someone young, fresh and charming.
But Rebecca was so charming and clever. People still remember her.
Maxim will be very unhappy to hear you talking like this, Mrs. De Winter. Forget the past, as Maxim has done. None of us want to bring back the past. Your job here is to lead us away from it.
I was much happier now, but I had to ask Frank one more question. Tell me, Frank, I said, was Rebecca very beautiful? Frank turned away from me so that I could not see his face.
Yes, he said slowly. Yes, I suppose she was the most beautiful woman I ever saw in my life.
Chapter 11. The China Cupid. I did not see very much of Mrs. Danvers. She sent the menus to the morning room every day. She rang me every morning on the house telephone. She had also found a maid for me called Clarice. Clarice was new to Mandalay, and this was her first job. Her family lived near Mandalay, but she had never known Rebecca. To Clarice, I was an important person, because I was Mrs. De Winter. Mrs. Danvers was certainly an excellent housekeeper, and I began to lose my fear of her. Sometimes I felt sorry for Mrs. Danvers. It must hurt her to call me Mrs. De Winter when, all the time, she was thinking about Rebecca. Frank had told me to forget the past. I wanted to, but Frank did not sit in the morning room every day as I did. He did not sit at Rebecca's desk and touch the things she had touched. Dear God, I did not want to think about Rebecca. I wanted to be happy. I wanted Maxim to be happy too, but Rebecca was always in my thoughts and dreams. Beatrice, Maxim's sister, had promised to give me a wedding present. She did not forget. One day Robert brought a large parcel into the morning room where I was sitting alone. I cut the string excitedly and tore off the dark brown paper. Beatrice had sent me 4 big books about painting. She knew that I enjoyed sketching, and she had really tried to please me. I was glad to have something at Mandalay that belonged to me. I looked round the room for somewhere to put the books. I stood them in a row on top of the desk and looked at them. But the books were far too heavy. First one fell, and then the others followed. A little china ornament, which always stood on the desk, was knocked onto the floor. The ornament broke into many pieces. It was a beautiful little Cupid, and one of the loveliest things in the house. I was suddenly very frightened. I found an envelope in the drawer, and carefully put the pieces of china into it. Then, like a child, I hid the envelope in the desk. I decided to put my new books in the library, and I said nothing about the Cupid. The following day after lunch, Frith brought our coffee to the library as usual. Instead of leaving, he stood by Maxim's chair.
"Could I speak to you, sir?" he said.
Maxim looked up from his paper. "Yes, Frith, what is it?"
"It's about Robert, sir. He's very upset. Mrs. Danvers has accused him of taking a valuable ornament from the morning room. Mrs. Danvers noticed it was missing late this morning. She says that Robert must have taken it or broken it. Robert says he knows nothing about it."
"Perhaps it was one of the maids," said Maxim. I knew he hated any kind of trouble with the servants.
"No, sir. No one except Robert has been in the room, apart from Madam, of course. Mrs. Danvers doesn't let the maids clean the morning room."
"Well, Mrs. Danvers had better come and see me. What ornament was it?"
"The china Cupid, sir. It stands on the desk."
"Oh dear," said Maxim, That's very valuable. It must be found. I'll see Mrs. Danvers at once."
"Very good, sir," said Frith, and quietly left the room.
"Darling," I said to Maxim when we were alone, "I meant to tell you before, but I forgot. I broke the Cupid yesterday."
"You broke it? Why didn't you say so when Frith was here? You'll have to explain to Mrs. Danvers now."
"Oh, no. Please, Maxim, you tell her. Let me go upstairs."
"Don't be silly," said Maxim angrily. "Anyone would think you were afraid of Mrs. Danvers."
"I am afraid of her. At least, not afraid, but—" The door opened without a sound, and Mrs. Danvers came into the room. I looked nervously at Maxim. His face was half amused, half angry.
"It's all a mistake, Mrs. Danvers," Maxim told her. "Mrs. De Winter broke the Cupid herself. She forgot to tell us."
I felt like a child again. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I never thought Robert would get into trouble."
"Is it possible to repair the Cupid, madam?" said Mrs. Danvers.
She did not seem surprised. I felt she had known the truth all the time. "I'm afraid not," I said. "It's in hundreds of pieces."
"What did you do with the pieces?" said Maxim.
"They are in an envelope in a drawer of the writing desk."
"Find the pieces, Mrs. Danvers. Try to get them mended in London." "I never thought that Mrs. De Winter had broken the ornament," said Mrs. Danvers.
As she left the room, I could see the scorn and hatred in her eyes. "I'm very sorry, darling," I said. "It was very silly and careless of me."
"Forget it," said Maxim. "But you do act strangely sometimes. More like a servant than the mistress of Mandalay. Even when we have visitors, you sit on the edge of your chair and say only yes and no."
"I can't help being shy."
"I know you can't, darling. But you must learn to hide it."
"I do try, but I'm not used to this kind of life. People look at me and ask me so many questions."
"What does it matter? They are interested in us, that's all."
"They can't find me very interesting," I said. "I suppose that's why you married me. You knew I was dull and quiet. No one would ever gossip about me." Maxim threw his paper on the ground and got up from his chair. His face was dark with anger and his voice was hard.
"What do you know about any gossip down here?" he said. "Who's been talking to you?"
"No one. No one at all." Maxim stared at me.
"Perhaps I did a very selfish thing when I married you," he said slowly. "I am so much older than you."
I felt cold and frightened. "Age doesn't matter," I said. "I'm happy. You know I love you more than anything else in the world. I love Mandalay too. I love everything here. You're happy too, darling, aren't you?" Maxim did not answer. He stood staring out of the window. "If you don't think we're happy, you must tell me," I went on. "I don't want you to lie to me." Maxim took my face in his hands.
"How can I answer you?" he said. "If you are happy, then we are both happy."
He kissed me and walked across the room. "But you are disappointed in me. You think I'm not right for Mandalay. If only I hadn't broken that Cupid. Was it very valuable?"
"I think so," Maxim answered. "It was a wedding present. Rebecca knew a lot about China."
Maxim went on staring straight in front of him. "He is thinking about Rebecca," I said to myself. "I have broken one of their wedding presents." Maxim went back to his chair and picked up his paper. I sat on the long seat under the window. After a time, Jasper came to me and climbed onto my lap. Chapter 12. In the West Wing. Maxim had to go up to London at the end of June. It was the first time that I had been left alone at Mandalay. I was sure that Maxim would have a terrible accident, or even be killed. I was too worried to eat any lunch. At about 2 o'clock, Robert brought me a message. Maxim had arrived safely in London after a good journey. I felt happy again, and also rather hungry. I went back into the dining room and took an apple and some biscuits. Then I called Jasper, and we went together into the woods. As I sat there, I felt happier than I had ever been at Mandalay.